let's hear about those dry stone walls. Bruce Munday, thank you.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about stone walls tonight, but I should point out that this is really more a geography lesson than a tour of stone walls. It's as much about the people that we encountered and the people who are responsible for these stone walls as the walls themselves. The walls are sort of a framework for the book and therefore the talk, but the people we met and the experiences that we had are really what it was all about. So I'm going to take you for a bit of a tour around South Australia and see some of these stone structures. When I first started writing this book, a couple of my kids said to me, "What's this about, Dad? Who on earth would be interested in stone walls?" And I did ask myself, I wonder, where did this interest come from? This is a stone wall on the property next door to us. And at one stage, a neighbour who shared the boundary started pushing some of it down with his front end loader. And when I asked him why he was doing that, he looked at me aghast and said, "Because it's old." And the irony of this, of course, is that when Kristin and I moved to South Australia, one of the great attractions was the oldness of the stone buildings, the wonderful stone architecture that South Australia has, bragging rights which I think we take for granted. The architecture in South Australia, Adelaide used to be known as the city of churches, but to me it was the city of stone buildings, lovely stone buildings, and I think we should be far more proud of it. And when we first came here in the 70s, pushing them down was all the rage. Fortunately, South Australians grew out of that fairly quickly, and now we're more into preserving them, which is great. It wasn't actually a eureka moment, but there are a number of things which also got me interested in stone walls. I'm sure people here recognise that. It is Machu Picchu, that's right. Chris and I went to Peru, I think in 2003. And the interesting thing about this is that when you walk the Inca Trail, you don't see Machu Picchu in the distance sort of gradually getting closer, but rather you come up over a rise and all of a sudden, there it is. And it is just so grand, so unexpected, even though you've spent several days passing all these wonderful ruins, stone ruins and so forth, and people asking questions about how did they build them and so forth. When you see Machu Picchu for the first time, it's truly breathtaking. And the other thing which is so wonderful about it, of course, is that we don't know the story behind Machu Picchu, because the Inca didn't have a written language, didn't even have drawings. So they constructed these wonderful things without leaving us a story about how they did it. This is in Cusco, the old Inca capital, and the stonework, of which this is just one of many, many examples, is so meticulous, so perfect. To imagine that this was built in the 16th century is really quite extraordinary. And so that got me asking questions like, who built the stone walls in South Australia? Nothing like as grand as this, of course, but nonetheless very impressive. And so we wondered, has anyone written the history of these stone walls? And to my surprise, no one seemed to. So I thought, well, there's a book. So let me show you a few. This is one which I think every one of you has seen. It is? That's right, on the road to Victor Harbour. Yep, that's right. Most people only see it from the vantage point of those cyclists. Driving on the top, all they see is a parapet about 1 metre high, and hardly anybody stops, even though there's plenty of opportunity to do so. I urge you, next time you go to Victor, stop and have a look. Because when you look over the side, it is absolutely wonderful. It's about 5 metres high, all dry stone, and by dry stone I mean it's built of stone without any mortar. Okay? All dry stone, and it sits on a slope of about 45 degrees. Wonderful piece of civil engineering, and also quite artistic. All dry stone, and it's called Cut Hill. Called Cut Hill because all the stone was cut from the hill immediately behind it. So promise me, next time you go to Victor, stop and have a look at that. It's the only dry stone structure in South Australia which is nationally listed. That's right, Waterfall Gully. Not dry stone, in fact, but dry stone look-alike. Because there is a lot of dry stone at Waterfall Gully, but when this was built for quite recently by the Department of Environment. In the first instance, it collapsed quite quickly because there wasn't a complete understanding of the hydrology of that particular area. In a particularly wet year, water built up behind it and the whole thing fell apart. But it was rebuilt, and to the great credit of the Department of the Environment, they did build it true to style. And around the kiosk on the other side there are a number of dry stone walls, terraces, and also a wall immediately in front of the kiosk. You can't see much of it there, which is dry stone, about 3 metres high and built without a footing at all. It still was intact today as when it was built in 1912. So it's a nice style, but bear in mind it's not dry stone, it just looks like dry stone, there's water behind it. This one is a little bit different. It's not actually a wall, but rather the floor. And this is in Brownhill Creek, immediately behind the Goodwood Orphanage. And the interesting thing about this is that the stone was built, the stone was taken from offcuts from the orphanage itself. When the orphanage was built, there's a whole lot of stone offcuts left over. The creek was realigned to obviate flooding problems. Some things never change. And the creek was lined to prevent any further erosion. It runs for about 150 metres along there, still intact as it was the day in which it was built, over 100 years ago. Okay, this is moving out into rural South Australia, and this is at Cainton. Jill, you were out there the other day, a set of stockyards. And interestingly enough, Jill, these yards are referred to as Miles yards. They belong to, they were built by someone by the name of Miles, I think that was the family name. And again, these were probably built in about the 1860s, so 150 years old. I wonder how many stock have been through them. They are still substantially intact. The hazard that they face is mainly falling timber. When the timber comes down, it tends to damage the walls, as you would imagine, and the yards are not used now, but it would not be impossible to bring those back to a condition where they could be used, not that there would be any incentive to them. And these walls are on the property Cainton Station, which is owned by the Keynes family. And I think probably the greatest gift that I was offered in writing this book was the Keynes journals. The journals which were kept by Joseph Keynes, who was the first settler at what is now called Cainton. 1843, came out from Devon. And Joseph Keynes used to sit down every night and he would write a paragraph in his journal about life on the land. Not about stone walls, but just about life on the land. And there are 8 volumes of this. It goes from 1843 until I think about 1879. And I was loaned these by the present day Joseph Keynes, great-great-grandson. And it was just one of those things that once I started reading it, I couldn't put it down. It was extraordinary. A lot of it is mundane, just everyday travails of people who are living on the land. But it provided such a wonderful insight into what that life was like. Those stations, remember, these were the first squatters in South Australia. Squatting in South Australia, of course, was very different to the eastern states. Where in the eastern states there were sort of almost no laws, just go out there and take over the land. In South Australia it was done in a fairly regulated way. Let's survey it as we go and so forth, and let's work out property boundaries and so forth. But nonetheless, these people were genuine explorers. They were the first people to move into this territory. Everything was brand new. And they had to be enormously self-sufficient. So that the stations themselves were almost little villages. They grew all their own food. They made everything they needed. They would have cobblers and saddlers and blacksmiths, and in many instances, wallers. People who came out from usually the UK with walling skills in building with stone. But in the very early days, of course, they didn't even have stone walls. They didn't have fences. There was no need because they had shepherds. But in the 1850s, the shepherds disappeared. Well, it didn't disappear, but they moved on to goldfields. Essentially the goldfields, and also the copper mines, but mainly the goldfields. They figured that mining for gold was better fun than looking after daggy sheep. You can understand that. And so therefore the pastoralists were then faced with this dilemma. How are we going to contain the animals? We need to build fences. In the eastern states, many of the fences were post and rail fences. South Australia wasn't blessed with the timber that the eastern states had, but they were blessed with stone, plenty of it. And so by picking up the stone, you did two things. You cleared the paddocks for agriculture and you built containment structures. The very first fences were really built to keep animals out, keep animals away from their homestead. And then when they became more extensive, they were built to keep animals in, stop them from wandering into neighbouring properties. But that wasn't until about the late 1850s that people got serious about building these dry stone walls. The shepherds had gone. They had learned the perils of bushfire, they'd learned the perils of white ants, and they realised there was a better future in stone than there was in timber. This is out Eden Valley, behind Eden Valley at what's known as Pine Hut Road. Wonderful precinct of dry stone walls in South Australia. It still beggars belief that this is not a major tourist asset for South Australia, because people who do come across from other states and I take them out of this region, they marvel at it. There's just miles and miles of these stone walls, and many of them still substantially intact, still in very good condition. The property in the foreground is called Netherford, belongs to the Lillycrap family, and I once said to Roger Lillycrap, who's now well into his 80s, I said, Roger, how is it that you managed to maintain these walls in such wonderful condition? And he looked at me as if I was a bit daft. He said, I would be embarrassed if I didn't. He said, they're such a wonderful heritage item that to not look after them would be a sin. And so he just, to him it came natural that you just, of course you would look after them. And this is another one just across the road really, at a property called Waroona. Malcolm Linky owns that property, has now passed it on to his daughter. Those of you who've seen stone walls in Yorkshire wouldn't find this very surprising, but in South Australia it is a bit unusual. That country is so steep, it's all you can do to stand on those slopes, let alone build a stone wall of them. Obviously when they built the wall they would start at the bottom and move up, and it's all terraced, because if you went straight up the slope, of course the wall would be at risk of sliding down the slope. So all these little mini terraces go all the way up the hill there as they built the wall on top. Still in wonderful condition, over 150 years old. And the secret of this is a number of things. One, it's a fairly high wall, so therefore less likely to have kangaroos jumping over the top. Kangaroos tend to vault over the top, and so therefore they kick the stones off the top. The other thing which is very important is these stones along the top, and you would have seen these in some of the earlier shots that I showed you. They're known as, Jill? Coping stones, that's right. And Jill's promised me she won't ask me where that word came from. Not capping stones, but coping stones. And it's really important because the wall itself, the main part of the wall, is essentially two walls, this is a cross section, leaning in on each other like so. Just slightly battered so that they lean in on each other, self-supporting to some degree, and then across the top is this coping stone, which bridges those two. Now, the important thing is that you've got the whole weight of that stone, which might be 20 kilograms, sitting on a narrow surface, like so, okay? So you've got the whole weight bearing on a fairly small surface. A little high school physics, pressure is force per unit area. So if you reduce the surface area on which it's imposed, then of course you increase the pressure. So there's quite a strong pressure sitting on that compared with if the stone at the top was just sitting like that. And that's the secret of the success. It's tying those two walls together with a very considerable force. And so you almost always find in these rural settings where livestock are imposing pressure on the wall that there will be coping stones along the top. And those coping stones are what ties the whole thing together and gives it its stability. Where the wall fails, for example up there, it's usually on account of the coping stones being dislodged by one means or another, and then other animals follow it, cattle push up against it, sheep go over the top and so forth, and then degradation sets in. So the coping stones are extremely important in terms of the stability of the wall. Kristin and I were out at Eden Valley in 2013, just after the bushfires that went through that area, 70,000 hectares of land which was burnt. And we were just there after the fire, sort of helping them mop up. And this is at Jeff Kane's property. And someone said to us, if you've been just out further, you'll find where the fire stopped. And it stopped when it came to the stone wall. And you can follow this wall for about another 3 kilometres and the fire completely stopped. Now you could say there wasn't a lot to burn on that side of the wall, and that's true, but nonetheless, that stone wall obviously did serve a very important purpose in terms of preventing the bushfire from travelling any further. And a couple of weeks later, I went over that area in a microlight and saw the same sort of thing. Many, many examples of where the stone wall had actually stopped the fire. Here's the fire coming up from below, heading from south to north, in fact, and it prevented the fire going any further. Now, it doesn't work, of course, where there is trees and so forth hanging over the fence, but if it's grassland, very effective in stopping the fire. And this was something which was remarked upon by George Goyder in the 1860s. During the 1860s, there were 3 consecutive years of drought up through the mid-north and the far north. And if you try and take yourself back to that time, to the 1860s, many of the settlers who'd moved into that area had not been in South Australia for very long. They might have experienced a year of drought or so, but no one had experienced 3 consecutive years. And so they'd gone off with this great sense of adventure that here's this wonderful land that we're now going to colonise, we're going to depasture all our livestock on, and it will always be like this. Every year will be normal. And then, of course, they were confronted by 3 consecutive years of drought, vastly overstocked. And so then there was this great migration of stock out of the north down to the south, looking for green grass down at Mount Gambier or something like that. The pastoralists, of course, complained that life was extremely difficult and they wanted the government to fix it for them. The government wasn't all that sympathetic, even though there was a very strong representation of the pastoralists in the government, but they weren't all that sympathetic to the squatters, who they felt were getting a lot for nothing anyway, because leases, of course, were very cheap in those days. So eventually they succumbed to the pressure and sent Goyder, who was the Surveyor General, up to the north to explore the situation and report back. Is it as serious as they're making out? And as you know, he went there. Matting Goyder's line was almost incidental to what he was up there for. But when he came back, he reported to the Parliament that indeed it's every bit as severe as they make out. He said, imagine the position of a farmer at Burra who is confronted with drought. And he wakes up in the morning and he's got not only his own flock of sheep to manage, but all the neighbours coming down from the north, heading south, and they're all passing through his property. I say his because they were mainly men, of course, all those pastoralists were men. And he said, the situation is totally unsustainable. Until they start fencing these pastoral runs, this situation will persist, and it will be totally unsustainable. And he said they need to fence it. And he listed the various types of fences, post and rail, etc., etc. There were no such thing as post and wire in those days, because wire was as thick as your thumb and came in lengths of about 50 metres. And so it was impossible to fence large areas with post and wire. But he said, where you've got stone, use stone. And amongst its many other virtues of clearing the land and so forth, he said it will stop a normal grass fire. And that's a lesson which we've learned over and over again, right up until today, that these stone walls will be very, very good at arresting grass fires. And I've seen many examples of that. This is a set of dipping yards at Rosebank. Rosebank is the McLaughlin property at Mount Pleasant. It was 70,000 acres and it used to shear 70,000 sheep a year. And these are the yards in which the sheep would be brought before they were dipped. In those days it was a plunge dip to control parasites, particularly lice and blowflies and so forth. And so when you think, and it's a beautiful thing because it's curved, as you can see, which works very well for sheep. Sheep don't like being boxed up in corners. They move very well around a gentle curve. And again, this was built in the 1860s. And the owner, Gus McLaughlin, says that no stone on that wall has ever moved. The only thing which has changed in those stones is the amount of lichen which grows on them over that period of years. And if you imagine the number of sheep that have been through there, at 70,000 sheep a year, nothing like that now, of course, and it served that function, and at the same time it is still very aesthetic. It's a thing of great beauty, I think, and therefore very commendable that it's still maintained. Not that there's much effort in maintaining it. We don't know much about the people who built these stone walls because they were just wallers. They were craftsmen, but not particularly notable. People didn't write books about them. They built fences. This guy, on the other hand, was well known, Levi Meekins. He came out with his father and he first settled at Forreston in the 1850s. Meekins started working for his father at the age of 9, building stone walls. And he went on to build miles and miles of stone walls out in that eastern Mount Lofty Ranges region. He was generally regarded as being the prince of dry stone walls, if you can imagine that. And he's mentioned in Keynes' journals. When Keynes started building walls, and Keynes himself, I don't think ever dirtied his hands building walls, but he employed wallers. And he had several teams of wallers out there building. And he would comment in his journal on how good they were at what they did, the technique that they were using, and in particular, how well they could manage a team. They usually worked in teams of 4, 2 adults and 2 children. The 2 children would fetch the stone on a sled behind a horse or a bullock, and the 2 men would then build the wall. That was the general procedure. And what Keynes liked in particular about Meekins was that he was very good at working with the team. The team was happy to work with him, and it was hard yakka. They'd go out on a Monday morning and come back on a Saturday night, camp out, and that was it. They'd have Sunday off. And Keynes notes in his journal that he gave his workers 2 days a year off. Good Friday and Christmas Day. The only exception he made was when his son Richard was married. He gave them another day. So, you know, it was hard yakka in those days. And Keynes notes in his journal, 1 August, he said, I rode out to the wallers today. It's bleak out there. And in February, another occasion, he wrote in his journal, rode out to the wallers today, complaining that the stones are too hot to handle. I don't know whether he gave them gloves. But it was hard work, but he had very high regard for these wallers, who did a good job. He was very, very encouraged by the quality of their work, and they did miles and miles of work for him, and also for others, Melrose and McBean, and so forth out that way. So there's a marvellous network of stone walls out there at the moment, many of which are degrading, of course, but many of which are still in almost pristine condition. It's quite extraordinary. There are not many things which have lasted that long. This is a note, I don't expect you to read it, but it's a promissory note or a contract note from John Murray, who owned Rhine River, what is it, doesn't matter, station out that way, to Meekins to build a certain amount of stone walling for him at 5 and 6 a rod. How far is a rod? How long is a rod? Some of you went to school about the era that I did. Right? Let me ask you another question. The wallers could normally build, a good team of wallers could build about a chain a day. Right? How long is a chain? 22 yards, length of a cricket pitch, so about 20 metres. A rod is a quarter of that, about 5 yards. So he's paying 5 and 6. They started off in the 1850s paying 4 and 6, and then with inflation it went up. Once it got to 5 shillings a rod, that's £1 a chain. And that's the sort of notional figure that people often use, the price of building a wall. But it depended on a lot of things. How high is the wall? What's the terrain like that you're working on? Is the stone immediately available, or does it have to be fetched, and so forth? But the going figure was usually, could do a chain, 4 people could do a chain a day. That's an amazing effort. And they would be paid £1 a chain. That was about the 1860s. So that's about the going rate. In some cases, that would vary where the wall's a lot lower or something like that. Anyway, essentially a waller was being paid about the same rate as a shearer in those days, in terms of what they could achieve in a day. So clearly it was regarded as a craft. They weren't just, and I don't say this disrespectfully, not just common labourers, but rather craftspeople. And George Melrose, who settled Rosebank Station, commented in his journal that not 1 man in 100 could build a good stone wall. There's a big difference between a good stone wall and just piling stones on top of each other. And those people who have built stone walls know that. This is something which you might have seen if you drive from Birdwood to Manham, down that road as it goes down Palmer Hill. On your left as you head towards Palmer, there is a little stone hut, and behind it is this one, which is a little shearing shed, a little tiny little shearing shed, and it's dry stone. built without mortar. The hut in front of it is mortared. And you'll notice that there was once a window there, but that's been filled in. You notice that because there's that vertical line there, that's called a running joint, and no good dry stone wall would ever have a running joint. So that's been filled in. And the little hut in front of it, which is not much bigger than that shearing shed, was, it's called Love's Hut. And when I first heard about that, needless to say, my imagination ran wild. But in fact, it was occupied by Angela and Andrew. I think I might have got one of those names wrong. Love, that was their family name. So that was why it was called Love's Hut. And they lived there from about 1868 until 1895, and both died, quite innocently apparently, on the same day. And the last person who lived in that hut permanently was Eddie, I think that was her name, Ernie Selvin. And he came back from the Second World War with shell shock. And he lived out there more or less as a hermit. It's not very far from the township of Palmer. Anyway, he was generally considered to be quite religious. And someone once asked him, if you're so religious, why don't you ever come to church? Why do you so seldom come to church? And he said, well, when I come to church, I spend most of my time thinking about running my traps. And when I'm out there running my traps, I spend most of my time thinking about my God. Now this is up through the mid-north, near Steelton. And this was a little wall, doesn't look terribly impressive, but it is quite interesting. It was Gottlieb Bain, who came out from Prussia in the 1860s, basically to escape military service. He landed at Port Adelaide and spent 3 days walking from Port Adelaide, I think, to Saddleworth, and eventually took up 200 acres at Steelton. And he had a girlfriend who lived at Tanunda, but he decided walking from Steelton to Tanunda to see his girlfriend was a bridge too far, and he encouraged her to move up to Steelton with him. And amongst other things, they built this stone wall. It's quite unusual because these stones are quite small, and because they're so small, they're sort of bookended by some pillars, dry stone again, just to hold that bit of wall together while it was completed before moving on to the next bit. And so Gottlieb is generally credited with building this stone wall. But when I read the history of the Bain family, B-E-H-N, I discovered that in fact Gottlieb's wife, Anna, fetched all the stone in a wheelbarrow from a ridge up there 150 metres away. All the stone for that wall was fetched, and the wall runs for about half a kilometre. And usually when I tell this story in probably a less civilised audience than this, the men sort of sit back with quite a smile, and the women grimace. This audience is obviously far more civilised than that. There is another stone wall not very far from that, another property, exactly the same situation, where the man is credited with having built the wall, but his wife fetched all the stone in wheelbarrows. And he was an Irishman, not a German. This is at Catlunga Station at Mintaro. Mintaro is a lovely heritage town with a lot of stone buildings and so forth, and Catlunga is a very significant station just on the outskirts, just past the quarry. And this stone wall is actually around the garden of the homestead, and the garden is quite extensive. You know, it's the size of Adelaide Oval at least. And this beautiful wall was actually built by Italian internees during the Second World War. And you'd be aware that during both wars, a number of aliens who found themselves in Australia, either as prisoners of war or as internees, were, if they weren't seen to be a security risk, they were put to work on farms where there was obviously a labour shortage. And so these two Italians were working on Catlunga Station, and among other things, they built this stone wall and some others as well. And they left a little inscription on a plaque on the other side of the wall. Prisoners of war, Italy, Lucella, Giacomo, and Trombetto Tommaso. And at the end of the war, of course, they were repatriated back home to Italy, and John Melrose, who owned this property, immediately sponsored their migration back to Australia. And this was not at all uncommon, because so many of those internees and prisoners of war were seen to be, A, very good workers, had skills, and basically good human beings. And given an opportunity, the people who had hosted them realised they'd make great citizens, great migrants to Australia, and that's certainly been the case. This doesn't look much, but it is enormously important. This was on Hill River Station in the mid-north, which is between Farrell Flat and Clare. And this is the start of the longest dry stone wall in Australia. It runs for 67 kilometres, if you can imagine that. Hill River Station belonged to C.B. Fisher, who, if you're interested in horse racing, you remember the C.B. Fisher Plate, which is held at Moonee Valley the week before the Melbourne Cup. Fisher owned Hill River Station. He was a very forward-looking pastoralist. He was ahead of his time in many, many ways. And one of the things he realised he had to do was fence his property. And so he started this. And Gerald Lally, who owns that property there, now called Claremont, he took us out to see this, the start of the wall. Gerald himself is a great historian. And it was quite a moving moment to be standing here at the start of this wall and trying to picture C.B. Fisher instructing the stone wallers. You'll start here and you'll finish at Booberawi, 67 kilometres away. Now, not the same wall that did the whole lot, of course. Patrick O'Grady is the one who is best known, and as you'd imagine up there, a lot of Irish wallers. O'Grady was just renowned for his wall building. But there would be many, many teams that worked on these walls, and they run all the way up through Mundurry, right up to Conowie and Booberawi and so forth. And 67 kilometres of it. Some of it is quite derelict now, but a lot of it is still in very good condition, and certainly this bit, and that's partly because Gerald is interested in history and he likes to look after this stuff. But it was quite wonderful, sort of standing there thinking, God, that's where they started, you know, building this thing. And poor little Patrick O'Grady, you know, this wonderful waller who just built miles and miles of wall, he's buried at Jamestown in the most insignificant little tombstone there. This man who built so many miles of stone wall has a tiny little tombstone. I hope he gets something better than that. Not all these stone walls, of course, were fences. Many buildings were built dry stone. And this is at Mount Bryan East, behind the old Collinsville sheep stud. Again, quite remarkable when you think how long this has been standing, from the 1860s, from what I can understand. And this is a barn, and behind it is a set of yards and so forth, stables and so forth. And these walls, extraordinary, it must be 4 or 5 metres high, still intact like that, even though the roof has blown off and the weather has got in and so forth. But such was their skill that they were able to build these things in such unforgiving circumstances, and still they survived for us. This is out near Peterborough, at Black Hill, a set of stables again, and you can probably see up here, this is where the roofing timbers were being. Going across, and again, there's quite an expanse of dry stone wall still standing there. These things will eventually fall down, that's the nature of things, of course, but they're wonderful relics for us, and it's such a reminder of just how energetic and how skillful those early settlers were up in that country, which really didn't repay them very well in the end. And this is going further north. Colin, I reckon you might know where this is.
Mount Lyndhurst?
Got it, Mount Lyndhurst, that's right, Mount Lyndhurst Station. This is a set of stockyards. Whoops, I'm giving away some trade secrets here. Those spikes on the top might give you a bit of an idea, Colin, you're not allowed to answer this one, what might have been in those stockyards. What sort of animals? Camels, that's right. How effective they was at containing camels, I'm not too sure. But I don't think camels have a great propensity for jumping fences anyway. It was probably more a case of just discourage them from running up against them. But you'll notice one of the things which is really quite interesting, I think quite charming about these dry stone walls in South Australia, is that wherever you go, the stone is different. And here it's a slate. Whereas a lot of what I've been showing you so far has been a schist or a siltstone, and you'll see more change as well. For example, when we go to the next one, this is down south of Edithburgh, and of course it's limestone. And terrible stone to work with because it's so irregular in its shape. Compare that with the schist that we saw just a moment ago. And the story behind this stone wall is that when I was writing the book, I read a book which was loaned to me about dry stone walls in Ireland. And it was just fantastic. It was a beautiful, beautiful coffee table book. And I said to my younger son, who's a graphic designer, I said, what is it about this book which is so appealing because obviously we wanted to capture some of that. And he said, well, they're not just all stone walls, they've got other items of interest in there. They've got animals or steam trains or people or something like that. So we, Kristin and I, had this sort of mission when we were doing the book that we needed to make sure when we took a photograph we got something interesting in there. And we're driving along, this is on the New Holland Road, and driving along, and I said to Kristin, watch out, there's a dog on the road. She said, it's not a dog, it's a bloody wombat. And so I wish that I'd had a video of Kristin talking to this wombat saying, please stand in front of this wall. Anyway, what we finished up with was pretty good, I thought, and I remember showing it to Lockie, that's our son, and I said, what do you think of that? And he looked, he said, the wall's out of focus. And you know, you can't please kids, can you? But it was quite unusual, this southern hairy nose, Colin, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is, and they're quite unusual down there, so that was quite a coup. But it's interesting, you know, it was once thought that you could never farm that area down near Edithburgh. No soil, no water. But when they discovered underground water, they thought, oh, okay, maybe if we pick up all these stones, there might be some soil underneath. And they picked up a lot of stone, most of which they crushed for road rubble. They also used for limestone for the Port Giles silos, and they built a lot of walls. And some of those walls are called consumption walls because they're so fat they just consume an enormous amount of stone. And there's one which is so wide you can drive a car on the top of it. But sometimes those, when they first started building these stone walls, the original walls they built were fences, were just what are called brush fences. They just cut down a tree. It's hard to imagine there were trees there, but there were. Usually she oak, they would cut it down, just lay it down, so that's a fence. Then when they started building these stone walls, in some instances they built the stone wall immediately over the trees. So the trees are lying down there and they just built the stone wall over them. And we were talking to a farmer down there about the stone walls. He said, yeah, he said, one year I was burning the stubble and the stone wall caught fire. And of course the stone wall caught fire because it had all this timber buried inside it. And they had to push down a large section of it just to put the fire out. This is on Eyre Peninsula, and if you're going to Eyre Peninsula and you're looking for dry stone walls, where would you go?
Near Elliston.
Elliston, that's right.
Capelwander.
Yeah. This guy's read the book. He's also been around a lot of South Australia. And took me over Capelwander as well, which I'd always wanted to see because I'd heard about it. And I later met Peter and I told him, I said, oh, I've been up and photograph this from the air. He said there was no need. He said we can go up and stand on the roof of the shearing shed and get a photograph, which we subsequently did, but not this photograph obviously. But in the shearing shed there is a lintel over the doorway, and written on it in chalk is, God created this place in 6 days, and on the 7th day he threw rocks at it. And yeah, Glenn was saying to me, he said, yeah, this place has an annual rainfall of about 300 millimetres, but it's effectively 600 because half the ground is covered by rock, so the other half gets double the normal rainfall because of the runoff. This is in the southeast. I didn't think we would find stone walls in the southeast. When you think about it, you know, other than sort of Mount Gambier limestone, which comes out of a quarry, there's not a lot of stone down that way, very little in fact. And I made, in some ways, a mistake, but in fact it was a great mistake to make. I did a radio interview with the ABC at Narracourt saying, I'd almost finished the book by this time, and I was sort of wondering, oh, can I bother going to the southeast? And so I mentioned, I'm writing this book, blah, blah, blah. No sooner had the interview finished than the phone started ringing. All these people who had stone walls they wanted to show me, very offended that I should think that there were no stone walls of any note down there on the southeast. And so we found many, of which this one is really quite a standout at Rome, a property called the Hermitage. And there's a whole network of these walls all around the property, beautifully maintained. You'll notice this one is sort of being overtaken by the vegetation. This is on the real fringe of the property, but around the garden there's some absolutely wonderful landscape features. And because the limestone is relatively soft, it can be tooled, which you normally wouldn't do on a rustic rural wall. And so you get a very nice tight fit, and it's really very, very artistic. And this was built by another Levi, this time Levi Cooper. And Levi came out from Dorset, I think, and he worked as a stonemason, and he built many buildings in Rome, not all dry stone, most of them would be mortared, but he built all these dry stone walls out at the Hermitage, which belongs to the Enright family, and I believe it's correct that Levi came a bit unstuck because he fell in love with Maggie Park, who herself, as a 17-year-old, went off and married Adam Lindsay Gordon. And so poor Levi Cooper, how could you imagine that, someone falling in love with a politician, jockey, poet instead of a stonemason? That's what she chose. And she used to work in the Caledonian Inn. So after she'd eloped with Adam Lindsay Gordon, poor Levi used to go to the Caledonian Inn every night to drink a pint, lamenting a love lost. And this was on Kangaroo Island, and we went down to have a look at an old shed, an apple shed, which is built dry stone, lovely little shed, which is still quite standing, but we found these pig pens. And I know in the background that's mortared, of course, but in the foreground it's not. But also there's a whole lot of turkeys. And of course turkeys are feral on Kangaroo Island. This is down near Lesueur Conservation Park. And there must have been 20 or 30 of these turkeys. I mentioned that when I started, I wrote a note in the National Trust newsletter about stone walls, and I had an absolutely charming letter from a lady by the name of Kathleen White. Anyway, she said, my daughter, Barbara, lives at Kinclarvin Station over in the Nullarbor, and she's built some stone walls. And Kathleen included a little photograph, not this one, of a stone wall that Barbara had built. I thought, that's pretty good. I mean, over in the Nullarbor, wasn't expecting that. And so I contacted Barbara and I said, I've been talking to your mum, or your mum sent me a letter and so forth and told me about some stone walls that you've been building. And so she emailed me back some more photographs. I thought, it's pretty good. So I said, where did you learn that? She said, on the internet. She said, I used the Cotswold style. That's what I decided would be appropriate for the Nullarbor. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to the Cotswolds. It's hard to imagine a part of the planet which is more different to the Nullarbor than the Cotswold. But she decided that was the style that she was going to build. And so she said, when we moved here, I love it out here on the station. I love the view and all that sort of stuff, but I wanted a garden. So I needed to have some way of keeping the kangaroos out. And so I started building these stone walls. And she said, once I started, I couldn't stop. Every time I went out in the four-wheel drive, I always came back with a load of stone. And I hear this from so many people, once you start, you can't stop. Anyway, so she built these stone walls, of which she can be very proud, I think. I think it's a marvellous job to build something that high. Lovely row of coping stones along the top. Hardly needed a wall that high, but they probably have big kangaroos out there. This is not South Australia, but I put it in just as a matter of interest. This is certainly the oldest dry stone wall built by Europeans in Australia. This is on one of the Abrolhos Islands off Western Australia. And you might remember the Dutch flagship, the Batavia, was wrecked off the Abrolhos Islands. And this photograph was sent to me by Hugh Edwards, who is a journalist slash adventurer slash diver who actually discovered the wreck of the Batavia in the 1950s and took other divers there to salvage it. And he said there are these little forts which have been built on various of the Abrolhos Islands, because you remember the crew mutinied after the wreck. Some of the officers went to Batavia to get help, and the crew that was left mutinied against the officers who were left. So the officers built these little forts to protect themselves. So these would arguably be the oldest dry stone walls built by Europeans in Australia in the 1630s. And when they salvaged the Batavia, they found in the ballast a whole lot of cut stone which had already been shaped. And the ship's almanac, the ship's journal rather, revealed that this was to build a portico in Batavia for the headquarters of the Dutch East Indies Company. And so when this was salvaged, the Maritime Museum at Geraldton, which is nearest port to where the wreck was found, rebuilt the portico. And there it is. Okay, just to finish off, when the book was launched, it seems ages ago now, some people asked, does anyone teach how to build these dry stone walls in South Australia? I didn't know anyone who did, but I did know this fellow in the yellow sleeves, who is a professional waller. He was living at Port Pirie at the time. He had come out from, not Yorkshire, Derbyshire. And anyway, he's a very good waller. He's a master waller, but he also had a very good personality. I thought he would be a good teacher. A good waller doesn't necessarily make a good teacher, in the same way as a good footballer doesn't necessarily make a good football coach. Anyway, I said to Wally, his name is Ian Carline, but he goes under the name of Wally the Waller. And I said, would you be interested in running a little workshop to show people how to build stone walls? Yeah, that'd be good. And so we went to Rosebank, which is where Mount Pleasant, where the book had been launched. And you can see there's an old dry stone wall there, but it's been damaged, mainly by falling timber. The whole thing had been tumbled down. It's about 200 metres of it. And so we thought, well, we'll run a little workshop for a few people who want to learn how to do it. And we did that on a weekend. I thought that'd be the end of that. The only trouble was these people had such a good time, they told all their friends who also wanted to have workshops. So we've now run 14 of these weekend workshops. I won't go through the details of it, but I think you can get the idea of that's how it goes. And it's all turned out pretty nice, so that now it looks like that. There's 200 metres of the thing. There is a section up there which goes for about 80 metres, which is substantially intact and didn't need to be rebuilt. The other 120 metres was done. And the thing which really pleases me about that is that about 110 people contributed to this wall, but it doesn't look as if it's been built by a committee. It's got a great uniformity of style, and that's because the instructor, of course, insisted on that style. And you see this in walls wherever you go. You see a style, and it varies depending on who built the wall, and of course what stone they used and so forth, and where that wall came from. And around Europe, for example, you see very distinctive styles. Distinctive to districts, distinctive to particular walls and so forth. And that again I think is part of the charm. It gives them so much character. I think that must be the end.